welcome and thank you for joining us today. Could you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and why you've decided to join our conversation?
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Davis Russell. Was born in Liberia, West Africa, and came to the United States first for college, graduate school, then stayed on as a professional. I've had most of my career has been in higher education, first as a faculty member, then as an administrator. And given my degrees, doctorate in education and in clinical psychologist, I've functioned as an educator and psychologist.
So to begin with, we probably should ask, what does power mean to you? How would you define having power, and why might you define it that way?
That's an interesting question for me because I've never thought of myself as having power. But when I think about power, I think about the ability to influence people and institutions to make change. And for me, going into psychology and going into education has been focused on making changes in the lives of individuals for the good. So the first thing when I became a faculty member, it was quite enriching because I was working with students who were first generation students, and that was making a change in their lives, that they could then see possibilities they had not seen before. And then as a psychologist, that was making change one person at a time. But as I thought about it, I thought, well, what kind of impact do I have, and what's the arena that will give me the broadest impact? So becoming an administrator within higher education, it said to me, give me then the opportunity to be able to influence policies, etc., that would have an impact upon not only students but faculty and staff as well. So power for me has been my ability to change individuals, but to change systems. And I think changing systems has been the focus, because while you may change individuals, particularly around issues like racism and sexism, if you have not brought about institutional change, then very little happens.
Mm-hmm. I find it interesting that that you say that you felt, at least initially in your life, that you didn't have much power because, by any measure, your resume is impressive. I think you'd be considered successful and even quite influential in your chosen field. But I do also understand that you faced some challenges along the way. Can you tell us about some of these?
Sure. Back in 1962, when I first arrived in the United States, I came here from England. I went to school in Michigan. And I was one of 2 black students in the whole institution.
Wow.
So during the orientation week, a number of us gravitated toward each other, and we found out that we liked classical music. So we were going to Detroit to a symphony where Van Cliburn was playing. So we went to the concert. Concert was over. We were really having a great deal of fun. Stopped at a restaurant to eat. And the story goes on that we waited and waited and people were served, etc. And finally we were told that we couldn't be served because I was in the group. So that was my first blow by racism. And not having had that experience before, it was quite quite devastating. But it generated an interest in me. So for my senior project, I wanted to know, what's the source of this? How early do people learn to become racist?
Yeah.
And so I did a study looking at 3 and 4-year-olds, showing them pictures and asking them to describe what they saw. And these were pictures of whites and blacks, etc. And to listen to their explanations of how they thought people got that way. And throughout their explanation, there was no hint of racism. I think one of the things that sticks in my mind, a funny story, a kid said, well, when God was making us, he was baking us, he put us in the oven to bake. And he got busy, and some of us got darker, and some got darker yet, so we have different shades. So that was their perception of what race was, nothing pejorative or whatnot. And so the conclusion that this is learned, and if it's learned, then my commitment was to help people unlearn or never learn racism. So my next step then was to develop a course. At the time I was with the City University of New York, and developed a course called Black Psychology, Black Perspectives, and had to fight to get that course instituted. It was intellectually sound, all the research was there, etc. And so finally the course was passed. But it's through changing the curriculum, changing policies, etc., that I worked to do that. As a professional, I think one of the things I found, and also found in my research, looking at Black women in higher education, is a common complaint you hear is that you are invisible, that your white colleagues will walk down the hall and don't even see you, even though you can be as big as a house or whatnot. But also, and this is common not just to women of color, but women generally, that your ideas, your points of view are not taken seriously, but that if they're echoed by men in a meeting, then those ideas are seen as very valuable, very innovative ideas, etc. So those factors, I think, factors that make women, and particularly women of color, feel an extra burden that one has to do much more than one colleagues to be recognized.
Would you say that any of these observations have, I guess, influenced your commitment to a lot of the research that you do?
Yes, it has. Not only that, but also to the teaching, and as I said, to instituting policy. So, for example, when I was with Alliant International University, which here in Fresno started as the California School of Professional Psychology, my emphasis was on working with folks to establish a track where students could be educated and trained to work with culturally different populations. And then when I became a provost and vice president for academic affairs at the State University of New York in Cortland, the emphasis there was working with faculty to not only infuse the curriculum, but to look at policies university-wide, to say how do we begin to change some of what is subtle institutional racism. And faculty work through groups like the Multicultural and Gender Center to help make those kinds of changes. So I think everywhere I've gone, I've not only looked at what the issues are, what the problems are with women and persons of color, but then to look at what can be done to eradicate those problems.
So that's an interesting question. What do you feel can be done? What do you feel at this point in time is in our power to do to to make these experiences more positive, more welcoming?
Well, I've done a number of things at different places I've gone. Everywhere I've gone, I've instituted something, worked with others to bring about some change. I have to tell you a funny story. When I went to Liberia, it wasn't racism, it was sexism. And talking with a faculty one day, a male faculty said, women who come here, meaning to Liberia, have to understand male rights and have to treat us better than they're treating us now. And I said, what are male rights? And he went on to spout this whole stream of sexist belief. And so I said, can you show me someplace in the Liberian Constitution where it says that men have rights that women don't have? And so I got a copy of the Constitution. And I was making a speech, and I said, it says that all persons are created equal under the law and in the sight of God. But nowhere does it say that male have special rights. So that kind of addressing, calling it out, and addressing it brings it center front. The other is setting up structures, I think, that enhance women's movement. So at SUNY Cortland, each year we started with a women's tea to welcome women in, and then a women's luncheon, and had seminars throughout the year focusing on women's issues, things like how do you balance work and childcare and whatnot, and working to strengthen the childcare situation, etc. In Liberia, the same thing, establishing a women's group, so to show women that they do have voices and can use their voices for change.
So kind of taking into account some of the social factors they're encountering, kind of meeting people halfway.
But you asked what can be done. One of the things that I'm doing here now at my church is to start what we're calling dialogues on race and racism. And that is to say, we need to change the nature of how we talk with one another about race and racism. Rather than entering into debates, we need to listen to one another and then talk with one another.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm sure that anybody who tunes into this later will feel the same way. Thank you so much.
Okay.